Hi, and welcome again to ECCB Connects. On today's episode, we share with you Dr. James Fletcher's perspectives on the challenges and opportunities for operating renewable energy businesses in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. Dr. Fletcher is a scientist and owner of SOLORICON, a sustainable energy and climate change consultancy firm. In his presentation during the Fourth Growth and Resilience Dialogue, Dr. Fletcher noted that all ECCU governments had committed to increasing the renewable energy penetration in their respective countries. He also outlined how the adoption of renewable energy sources could provide the opportunity for regional collaboration to improve scale, lower costs, expand markets, and increase resilience.
So the energy landscape in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union in particular, what we have in our utility companies is a very heterogeneous ownership structure. So you don't have a one-size-fits-all. So it's very tempting when we look at the ECCU to think that you could apply one solution and it's going to work in every single island. That's not the case. You have a situation where in some of your countries, like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, where the utility company is state-owned. In the case of Dominica, in the case of Grenada, it is privately owned. In the case of Anguilla and St. Lucia, it's a public-private partnership. So you have to understand that, to understand the policy prescriptions that can be applied and the leverage that the government has and the policymakers have in being able to effect change in that sector. As has already been stated, the cost of electricity is quite high. Across the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, the cost of energy, as Prime Minister Gonzalez pointed out, the final cost of energy is in the vicinity of around 33 to 35 US cents per kilowatt hour. That compares actually quite favorable with CARICOM at 33 cents. And when you consider that the price in CARICOM is actually brought down by Trinidad that probably pays somewhere in the vicinity of 10 cents per kilowatt hour, you'll see that in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, we're not doing too badly if you use CARICOM as our base. Obviously, compared to the United States and compared to the oil producers, we are not doing well. And that means that every single economic sector, particularly those that are important to us, like tourism, like agriculture, becomes non-competitive because of the high cost of a very significant input, which is energy. Every single one of our governments has made a commitment to increasing the penetration of renewable energy, every single one of them. And in some instances, it's as high as 100%. Dominica, Grenada, Montserrat. I'm not sure with St. Vincent and the Grenadines whether that figure has gone up. It was originally stated at 60%. I'm certain you have much more ambitious plans, Prime Minister. St. Lucia is at 35%, Antigua and Barbuda at 20%. But our potential is significantly more than that. Well, not more than the 100% of Dominica, Grenada, and Montserrat, but those of us that are not projecting for 100, almost every single one of us, particularly those of us who have a geothermal potential, have the potential to go much higher. And the main sources are solar photovoltaic, wind, hydro, geothermal, and some biomass. Not a lot of biomass because we have some issues with land availability. And also, even those countries that have decided to go waste to energy, there's not a lot of waste in that waste stream. So waste to energy is more from a solid waste management solution than as an energy generation solution. The economics don't make sense from an energy generation solution. There are some significant challenges. One of them is that many of our countries have long life electricity supply acts that convey monopoly status on the incumbent utility. So in the case of St. Lucia, for example, the St. Lucia Electricity Services, LUCELEC, has an 80-year monopoly on the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. That monopoly came into effect in 1965, so it expires in 2045. So there's another 25 years. In the case of Anguilla, I think there's a 50-year monopoly that came into effect in 1991. So every single one of these countries has an electricity supply act that makes it difficult without amendment to introduce independent power producers and to move in that direction. Now, that is not to say it's impossible. Laws are made and are amended in Parliament, but there's a process that has to take place, and in some instances, that process grinds a little bit slower than in others. There's need for a strong independent regulatory infrastructure, because if you want an external investor to come in, that investor has to know that his or her investment will be protected, his or her investment will not be subject to capricious policy making. So usually investors want to know that there's a very strong, robust regulatory authority in place. And in many of our countries, local institutional capacity is weak because this is a new space for us. So we are just getting into adopting energy as a policy. Usually we left policy making in the energy sector to the utility company. Now the government is the one determining how far we could go, how quickly can we go, what levels of renewable energies we should put on the grid. And that is something that requires capacity within the member states, and not all of our member states yet have that capacity. So what are the opportunities? Well, first of all, there is a significant opportunity for and potential for utility-scale solar photovoltaic with battery storage. This is when you enter St. Kitts and Nevis, what you see, but almost every single one of our countries is moving towards solar PV, and the good thing, as was said earlier, the cost of solar PV, solar photovoltaic, is going down, and the prices that we're getting for solar photovoltaic in the Caribbean are actually very comparable with what we're getting worldwide. And when battery storage now starts to go down, what it does is it makes solar a dispatchable resource. The problem with solar and with wind is that they're intermittent. You can only generate solar electricity when the sun is out. You can only generate energy from wind when the wind is blowing. However, if you can store that power with batteries, and when there's no more sun, when there's no more wind, you could then dispatch it onto your grid, then it makes that resource a baseload resource like we have with diesel and like we have with geothermal. So that's why the cost of battery storage going down is so important for the renewable energy thrust, particularly of an island like Antigua and Barbuda that does not have a geothermal resource and has to depend more on the intermittent sources, which are wind and solar. Wind is another. There's a strong appetite for rooftop distributed solar photovoltaic generation, and many of our consumers are moving in that direction. They are constrained a bit by some of the slowness with the regulator and the utility company in allowing this to take place. But there's also another caveat that I'll speak to in a few minutes that causes us to have a little bit of caution in how quickly we allow that movement to take place. Geothermal development is being pursued in Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia, all of the countries that have geothermal potential. And wind farm feasibility studies have demonstrated the economic viability of this resource. In St. Lucia, in Antigua, in many of our countries, there is significant. The adoption of energy efficiency standards and labeling will catalyze even more growth in that sector, because you can now see the transition of a lot of these high-pressure sodium and mercury vapor streetlights that are present in our islands that are causing us to spend a lot of money. It's causing our governments to spend a lot of money on street lighting, to now move towards LED street lighting, and even better, solar LED street lighting, which reduces the cost or almost eliminates that cost entirely. In the case of St. Lucia, the government of St. Lucia spends $11 million a year on street lighting. By moving to LEDs, it can cut that cost in half very easily. And that is something that pays for itself. Electric vehicles have the capacity to completely transform the energy sector, because this is important. What the utility company, the incumbent utility company, is always concerned about is a loss of revenue, because you're diminishing its revenue base. As you move towards renewables and you allow independent power producers to come on board, and you cause it to move away from diesel generation, it complains that its revenue base is being eroded. But with electric vehicles now coming onto the grid and extracting energy from that grid, it allows for that demand to grow. In my opinion, however, you will not see the proliferation of electric vehicles in our jurisdiction until we get to the point of having a used vehicle, electric vehicle sector. We did not see the proliferation of cars in our jurisdiction until we were able to go, until the individual was able to go on the internet and bring his car in himself. If you have to depend on the normal suppliers to provide you with electric vehicles, that cost will still be too high. So I think there'll be a bit of a lag time with electric vehicles in our jurisdiction. When these vehicles now appear on the used market and you can go online and buy it, I think you'll see an explosion, and we have to prepare for that by ensuring that we have the necessary charging infrastructure. There is one significant opportunity that I do not believe we pay sufficient attention to, and that is something called cold ironing or port electrification. Anytime a cruise ship comes to our port, that cruise ship has to keep its engines running. If we're able to say to that cruise ship, shut down your engine and plug into a power source at our port, a cruise ship uses anywhere between 5 and 10 megawatts of electricity when it is berthed in that port for 24 hours. So think of the impact that will have on your ability to now export energy. There is also the carbon footprint that cruise ship, you'll now be getting the cruise ship to reduce on its carbon footprint. There's an environmental consideration because there's less particulate matter being put out into the atmosphere by burning heavy fuels in these cruise ships. So this is a win-win, and this is particularly important for countries like Dominica, where you have a peak demand for electricity of 16 megawatts, I think. 18. But you have the potential to generate 200 megawatts and more from your geothermal. What does Dominica do with that 200 megawatts, so that excess 184 megawatts of electricity it is producing? If it's not able to sell that electricity to Martinique or Guadeloupe, and that will take some time, but if you could now say to Royal Caribbean and all of the others that both shut down your engine, plug into our ports, then it gives Dominica an opportunity to export that energy and make a significant amount of money. And also it allows the utility company to grow its demand, which is very important. So it's a win-win situation, and it's something that is extremely important and we should be pursuing. You could see St. Lucia with 4 cruise ships booked, what that potential would be for the government of St. Lucia and the utility company. There's also the potential for regional collaboration to improve scale, lower costs, expand markets, and increase resilience. We now have to start looking at bulk procurement. So if 3 of our countries are looking at going the route of solar, utility scale solar PV, or wind, why don't we look at a joint procurement? So instead of a 10 megawatt facility in St. Vincent, we're now looking at 30 megawatts of aggregated demand in St. Vincent, Antigua, and St. Lucia. That drives the cost down. So if we can find ways of aggregating demand and causing that market to get bigger, then we're dealing with a completely different scale. The other opportunity that is a more long-term one is the one I just referred to earlier, and that is interconnecting those islands. And interconnecting those islands allows us to expand the market, but also build in resilience. It means that if there is a hurricane, God forbid, that wipes out the electricity supply, wipes out the grid in one island, but there is an interconnection with another island. While you work to get your grid back on track, you can electrify certain parts of your island by having electricity move from Antigua to St. Kitts, or from St. Vincent to St. Lucia. Those are possibilities that we should look at, and these certainly are possibilities where you should bring in the big investors and tell them, look, this is something that is important to us. The energy sector investment needs, and I think this is coming, this is a paper that the IMF did a few years ago, but a paper that was presented to the OECS authority has suggested that the investment needs to bring the OECS to 70% renewable energy penetration is $2.4 billion US dollars. Now that is beyond the capacity of any single one of our member states. We don't have that fiscal space to allow for a $2.4 billion investment in the OECS, but it is necessary because of the economic impact that it will unlock. So what we now have to do is to mobilize climate funds, but we know the agony of mobilizing climate funds. But as I said yesterday at the climate lecture, we have to take a different approach. We cannot ask every single island to put up these big units in their respective ministries of finance or economic planning to access those climate funds, because the GCF makes you run through hoops to get money. EIB may not be as bad, but I'm sure the EIB does not just give you a check. So we need to look at maybe within the OECS Commission, establishing a unit whose sole responsibility is to work with these member states to produce these comprehensive, bankable projects that we can submit on a regular basis. We should be churning these things out. The Green Climate Fund, 40% of the monies it has disbursed has been for energy projects. None of that has come to the Caribbean. So we now have to take a totally different approach to this. I think there's also a need to look at establishing a regional energy fund to address the requirement for sovereign guarantees. Many of these investors, when they come in, they want the country to provide them with a sovereign guarantee. But we can't provide sovereign guarantees. With our debt to GDP ratios, we don't have that space. But maybe if you can have a fund that resides within a vehicle created by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, that we can now use that to backstop those requirements from the investors, then I think that can also help us unlock a significant amount of climate financing. Very quickly, some of the lessons learned, and this is a very important one. You have to enlist the buy-in and cooperation of the incumbent utility. If you don't, the utility will dig its heels in and say it is protected by a long life guarantee, and it will not move. So working with the utility is extremely important. Working with credible investors is also important. When I was a minister, I had investors coming to me telling me that they were oilmen from Texas, and they can assure me that they can dig for oil and get me, not the same way they dug for oil, they can dig for geothermal energy and get me geothermal energy in 12 months. I knew that was, pardon the language, I knew that was BS. But you need to have the necessary technical support to be able to filter out what is correct and what is not correct. And there are a lot of cowboys in this sector, and very often some of our governments get caught with these cowboys because of what they're offering, and we have to be able to filter them out. Partner coordination is critical. There are many partners tripping over themselves wanting to help you. We have to say to our partners exactly what it is we want them to do. We can't let them come and tell us that this is what we'll do and you have to take it in a package. We have to determine for ourselves what it is that we want them to do and identify how they work. Some risks have to be mitigated. One of them is that we have to take care that we do not create some price distortions that cause more social inequities in our country. The people who can afford to invest in renewable energy are the people who have money and who can afford their bills. So somebody, a hotel, a big hotel telling you that it wants to go 70% renewables, and you allow that hotel to get off the grid, the cost, the fixed cost to the utility company still has to be paid by someone. And that fixed cost will be paid by the poor people who can't afford to put in, who can't afford an outlay of $40,000 to put in a solar PV panel on their rooftop, or their roof is not even strong enough to accommodate a solar PV panel. So the government has this policy balance that it has to maneuver to ensure that you do not now create distortions in your market that will cause your vulnerable populations to become even more vulnerable because they will be left to shoulder the cost of this grid that has to be maintained. And finally, the Caribbean is ground zero for climate change. We know that disasters strike us with regular basis. Ambassador Henderson's country was victimized by Tropical Storm Erica to the point of 90% of its GDP was lost in damage in 2015, 226% by Maria in 2 years later in 2017. Grenada, over 200% of its GDP from Hurricane Ivan. This is something that, unfortunately, climate change will cause to be an even more regular occurrence, these high-intensity storms. And these high-intensity storms wreak havoc on electricity infrastructure. So we have to find money to make our infrastructure more resilient. And again, all the more reason that we have to go in and unlock those climate funds. There is a big opportunity to create jobs and to stimulate our economy from unlocking these climate funds, but even more so from a strategic and long-term approach to energy development. Thank you very much.
To view any episode of ECCB Connects anytime, any place at your convenience, check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn at ECCB Connects.
We've come to the end of this week's episode of ECCB Connects. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us next week when we bring you another episode to share with you who we are, what we do, and how we serve you.